I want to thank Alison Gill for agreeing to do this presentation as part of Gender Spectrum's September Education Program. Alison is an accomplished attorney and a nationally recognized expert on LGBTQ law. She currently works as a consultant to foundations and nonprofits focused on advocacy, strategy, and systemic change. Prior to her consultancy work, Alison served as senior legislative counsel at the Human Rights Campaign, where she managed state-level advocacy concerning conversion therapy, anti-bullying, education non-discrimination, trans issues, LGBTQ health and wellness, HIV policy, youth homelessness, and LGBTQ data collection. And Alison, thanks again for being part of our series on education and transgender and gender expansive youth.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you to Gender Spectrum for allowing me to talk about data advocacy today. So I'm going to first start with our agenda, first talking about why is data collection important for gender expansive youth. And secondly, I'm going to present a case study about the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is the nation's largest population survey on secondary school age youth. And finally, I'll talk about how you can engage in data advocacy in school. So just to clarify, when I say data advocacy, I mean that advocacy relating to increasing data collection and usage of data pertaining to health, education, and outcomes for young people, including gender expansive young people. And this workshop will focus primarily on schools, although data advocacy is a much larger discussion, and it's possible to engage in data advocacy at many different levels, both in schools and at the larger state, even federal level. I also want to note that I am not a researcher, I'm an attorney. And so I'm presenting this from an advocacy and standpoint, not a researcher standpoint. So if you were to have a researcher present this, they'd probably present it very differently. I just want to make that caveat that I'm presenting this from a certain standpoint. And what I say about research is primarily from my experience as an advocate and not a formal classification of research. So first of all, why is data collection important? Why is it important? And a lot of people don't understand or haven't thought about data collection and why it's so incredibly necessary to do work and to improve the lives of gender expansive young people. Well, frankly, and this is the one takeaway from this seminar, if there's nothing else, I want you to understand that without data, gender expansive students are invisible. They're invisible to educators, to policymakers, to funders, to everyone. If you can't show that there are disparities and that gender expansive youth face disproportionate risk, if you can't back that up and show it, then it's impossible to effectively advocate for this population. And so that's the primary reason data collection for gender expansive youth is important. Moreover, there's been a long time lack of data about these populations. Until recently, there's been no questions about gender expression or gender expansive youth on any sort of federal data collection and instrument. Most schools don't collect data, most states don't collect data. And so for the most part, there's just been very, very little information out there. This is starting to change, fortunately, and I'm going to talk about the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. However, until now, there's just been a data drought. And without fully understanding the needs of these youth, we really can't fully address the issues that they face, the health risk behaviors and discrimination they face, or really help them to thrive and succeed. Data is essential for things like adapting and creating new programs. For example, anti-bullying. We know that gender expansive young people face increased risk of bullying and harassment, but how do we make sure anti-bullying programs are effective and that they actually address things like gender expression without data to support that? Advocacy. So for example, for you as an advocate going into schools, it's very, very helpful to have data to back up your assertions and to say, well, we need this change, we need this policy, we need these programs. Improving services. So making sure that gender expansive young people get the services that they need and that they're adequate. This might be useful, for example, for IEPs when advocating for a gender expansive young person involved in such services. And also for seeking grants and funding. So basically grants from foundations, from the school board, for example, for different projects and programs, from the federal government. You really need data to back up your requests for funding and grants. And so that is really critical for that purpose. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of data collection and research. And I want to note just again, this is from my perspective as an advocate. If you were to ask a researcher, what are the types of research and data collection, you'd get a very, very different response. So this is how I think about it as a data advocate. Well, first of all, there's academic research, research by doctors, PhDs, found in journals, for example. Second is government data collection, and this falls in a few different categories, but two examples are population surveillance. For example, we look at a broad population, students, for example, and take a representative sample, and from that we're able to identify things like risk behaviors. So this is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, is an example of population surveillance. Longitudinal studies, and that's where you take a cohort of, for example, a sample, let's say gender nonconforming young people, and you follow them over time. That's why it's longitudinal. So you see how their lives develop, what their outcomes are years in the future, and you're able to relate that to things that they experienced when they were younger. There's organizational research, and a great example of this is the National School Climate Survey by GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, which provides just a wealth of data about bullying, harassment, and other issues, LGBT and gender expansive youth, based in schools, but conducted by the organization, not by academic researchers or the government. And then data collection by service organizations. For example, a hospital collects data about patients. Schools might conduct a local school climate survey. Any sort of data collected by local organizations about their services and the people that they serve would fall in that category. So primarily, this seminar will focus on population surveillance, government data collection and population surveillance, and also data collection by schools, which are a form of organization. Okay. So I'll start by looking at the gender expression question on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. The YRBS, or Youth Risk Behavior Survey, is a national survey administered by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which takes place in about 47 states and 20 large school districts, and also several territories like Guam. It is the nation's largest survey looking at secondary school age youth and their health risk behaviors. So it's where we get the majority of our health risk data for young people. And it looks at risk behaviors, which include a whole variety of factors, including drug and alcohol use, smoking, violence, bullying, suicidality, weight, inactivity, and nutrition. It consists of a core survey of about 60 questions that's decided on by the CDC, and an optional list of questions that are approved by the CDC. And then each individual site, that means each state or large school district, is able to determine which questions they use from the core and the optional survey, and the optional question list, up to about 99 questions, which is the maximum. Currently, there are 2 sexual orientation questions on the core survey. So those are used in every location unless the site actively opts to take them out. So the majority of sites do use 2 sexual orientation questions. There are no currently approved questions regarding transgender youth. However, there was recently a question added about gender expansive youth, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. It was added in 2013. So as I mentioned, there were optional questions pertaining to sexual orientation for years, but there's long been a gap regarding gender minority youth, which means transgender youth and gender expansive young people. The All Students Count Coalition, which is a coalition of national organizations focused on increasing data collection at the federal level and state level for LGBTQ young people, worked with the CDC and researchers to identify appropriate questions for transgender and gender nonconforming young people. And then GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, performed cognitive and pilot testing on several relevant questions. Based on this research, the CDC approved an optional gender expression question in 2013, and several sites have used it since then in 2015. And those sites, this is the question that was approved. It is a person's appearance, style, dress, or the way they walk or talk may affect how people describe them. How do you think other people at school would describe you? And you can see there are 7 responses varying from very feminine to very masculine. And by comparing this with the sex question that the student answers, we're able to identify students that are gender nonconforming or gender expansive. You'll notice that this question asks about how others perceive the student. That is a construct called socially assigned gender expression. And the reason it's asked this way is because a lot of the victimization that gender expansive students face is based on how other people perceive their genders, not their own internal sense of their gender. So it helps us understand victimization and resulting discrimination and negative health outcomes. I also want to note that this question does not expressly cover transgender youth. It's not able to identify or transgender youth or able to, it does not focus on them at all. It does not able to, they are not fall clearly either within or without this question. The question was used originally in 2013 and again in 2015 in 4 separate sites: Broward County, Florida; Chicago, Illinois; Los Angeles, California; and San Diego, California. However, until recently, the data has not been thoroughly analyzed, and it was not able to, for purposes of advocacy and also for just understanding what the outcomes were, there had been no analysis of the data. So even the sites themselves were not capable of analyzing the data, so they were not reporting on what gender expansive young people were facing. And this lack of analysis was really holding back advocacy for this question. So the majority of states, there's 47 states and about 20 municipalities that could add the question, but they didn't understand why they should add the question. I mentioned that there's a limited amount of space on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And without a full analysis, advocates were not able to talk about why it's important to add the question. We weren't able to present data, which goes back to my earlier point, why data is important. We weren't able to present data about what the question will say, what it will tell us, why we need a question around gender expression, particularly because there's already questions around sexual orientation. And moreover, no one knew how to analyze the question. It was a new question that was developed, so there was not a clear understanding about how to analyze it and report the data and what it meant, the new data. And so last year, in September, we released a new report through Advocates for Youth, released a new report focusing on all this data, looking at the responses to this question from these 4 sites and about 60 different health risk behaviors that the sites shared in common. Just a note about demographics. Among these 4 sites, there was a total sample size of about over 9,000 students who answered the question. There was a diverse racial breakdown based on the sites. About a quarter of the young people were Hispanic or Latino, a quarter white, a quarter Black, and about 20% were Asian or Pacific Islander. So it's a very diverse sample. And 12.4% of the combined sample identified as sexual minority youth, meaning that they were gay or lesbian, bisexual, or unsure of their sexual orientation. So it was a very diverse sample and allowed us to, for the first time, really break down and show the health risk behaviors faced by gender expansive youth. I won't get into the data in this seminar. However, there is a separate seminar that we did, and I encourage you to take a look at this report and that other seminar through Gender Spectrum. So I'm going to talk now about advocacy for this question and how we encouraged more sites to take up and use the question. The first part of the advocacy was publishing this report. It was really critical that we had this data so we could show sites why they should add the question. And it was really key to be able to demonstrate to sites both why they should add it and also how to analyze it in a way to produce effective data that they can use for other purposes. Also, this work was furthered by the All Students Count Coalition. So this is a national coalition of organizations which focuses on increasing data collection for LGBTQ young people so that we can better advocate for them and meet their health and education needs. It includes groups like Gender Spectrum, Advocates for Youth, GLSEN, Human Rights Campaign, the Trevor Project, PFLAG, and others. And this group was able to work with Advocates for Youth and others to conduct a great deal of outreach regarding this question last year. The Youth Risk Behavior Survey is a survey that's conducted every other year. And so basically there was about a year to conduct advocacy to get sites to adopt the new question. And then there is about a year where the surveys are conducted, the data accumulated, etc. So there was a short window with which this advocacy could take place. And the advocacy really focused on outreach to youth risk behavior survey coordinators. Each state and each site has a youth risk behavior survey coordinator. And we reached out to them through a variety of different methods, through mass emails to all of them, for example, outlining why they should include the question. We conducted several webinars for YRBS coordinators to help educate them about the question, about results in those places that used it, why it was important to add it, how it differed from things like gender identity and sexual orientation, why its gender expression was different, and how it would be a useful metric for them to look at. We also targeted about 50 states and sites, 50 sites, I should say, to conduct individual phone calls and direct outreach, speaking to them, addressing their concerns, and providing technical assistance. And also provided additional email support for those, repeated email support for those sites. So I think the phone calls were one of the most important tactics to basically advocate for this question adoption, because each site has its own completely individual and separate process for adopting new questions for the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So advocates really need to get understanding about how each site may basically what their process was for adding the question, and then providing them what they needed, whether it be a thorough understanding of the question, whether it be information and resources, whether it be community support or pressure to basically move forward with adding the question. We also created resources to support the question, including the report, but also one-pagers. And one-pagers are just an outline of the facts and the reasons that they should move forward with the report, with the new question on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So really just a breakdown of key facts, and it's more of a persuasive advocacy document. We also created things like sign-on letters with interested groups, and contacted local groups that we thought might have an interest in adding the question, groups involved with youth and LGBT issues locally, and education and health. And often we'd arrange for those groups to get involved with the process so that they would be able to help move forward and convince the YRBS coordinator and others in the system to add the new question. One interesting thing to note was that the most common question that we received was, well, why do we need to add a gender expression question if we already ask about sexual orientation? And so there was a lot of education that was needed to differentiate sexual orientation and gender expression and explain why it's important to ask both. And also the same thing is true for gender identity. A lot of places use a non-approved gender identity question so that they could identify health risks for transgender students. Now, this question was not approved by the CDC, so we're not really sure at this point how effective it is. But we always advocated for sites to use both the gender expression question and the gender identity question. So what were the outcomes? Well, I mentioned in 2013 and 2015, only 4 municipal sites used the optional gender expression question. However, in 2017, we believe at least 16 sites will be using the question, 8 of which are states. So this is the first time states will be using the gender expression question, which is very significant. So you can see it was quadrupled the number of sites that were using the question, which means in 2018, when this data starts to come out, there'll be a lot more data about gender expansive youth across the country, which is fantastic and will help us move forward with the issues we talked about earlier, advocacy, program funding and adoption, and a variety of other issues. I also want to note that about 15 sites are using a trans question that was provided by the CDC as sort of a pilot. This was not adopted yet, so we're not really sure how this is going to turn out. We hope that it works really well, but it still needs to be analyzed. And that question is right there. Some people, Some people describe themselves as transgender when their sex at birth does not match the way they think or feel about their gender. Are you transgender? And you can see there are several different options for response there. So I want to just switch gears a little bit and talk about how to engage in local data advocacy. I have sort of a checklist here. I think it's the first thing that's critical is to think about your goals. Why do you want the data? What is the purpose of it? How will it be useful to you? Is it useful, for example, to create a local anti-bullying program or make sure it's including gender expansive youth? Is it useful to support IEPs locally? Are you interested in getting your municipality to add questions to the youth risk behavior survey around gender expression or sexual orientation? So think about what your goals are and identify those clearly. Secondly, develop an advocacy plan. It's important to understand the process for how the change will be made, and then figure out who you need to get to make the change. For example, sometimes it's the superintendent of schools or a school principal that makes a decision about conducting a local school climate survey, for example. It might be the school board. It might be decided locally at the school level with the principals, or a teacher might be pushing forward with it. But it's important to understand where this needs to come from and to do some background research with contacts in the individual school district, for example, to understand how the change would be made, to start a new survey if one doesn't exist, or to advocate to add questions if there's already existing survey, going to, for example, the person who's responsible for administering that survey and inquiring about it. So think about not only who needs to be moved, but where will you get support? Is it possible to form a coalition with other groups like local youth groups, education groups, health groups that might have an interest in supporting this question or expanding it, or creating a new school climate survey, for example? Is something that parents groups will be interested in? So think about where you can begin to get support and begin to conduct outreach to those groups and pull together a group of people, a small coalition that can help you move forward with the project. Secondly, it's important to understand what questions you want to be added and to develop clear tools to support those questions. I mentioned earlier creating a one-pager which clearly describes the question or the need for having a local survey, for example. And using that resource to move forward can be really helpful, just something that spells out what your goals are and why. Creating some facts, talking about other locations where it's worked, talking about all the supporters of it. Those sorts of things are very helpful. There are some examples of this under the resources section, which I'll talk about later. Fourth, realize that change is gradual. It might take several years to add a new question to the youth risk behavior survey. To a school survey or the youth risk behavior survey. And just because one question is added, for example, a question around sexual orientation, it might be possible to use that in the next round the survey is administered and get them to add questions around gender expression, for example. So this is an iterative change. If you don't get everything you want at first, you can use the support and show that nothing went bad, the sky didn't fall, to move forward and add other questions. Or for example, let's say you're able to get one school to add a question. Well, maybe the following year, you could go to the school district and say, well, it's worked so well in school X, we should do this district-wide. And that's an example of gradual change and using one success to support others. And finally, and this is really key, you have to get the person collecting the data, often the school district or the municipality for the YRBS, get them to publish the data, get them to give it to you and use it for themselves, have them put out a report about it. Because it's, if you don't get the data, then there's no point. Everyone's wasted their time. So it's really critical to get the data. And with the youth risk behavior survey, for example, municipalities and states own the data. So the only way to get it is from those entities. You can't get it from the federal government. So you might be thinking, well, what's the problem here? Why don't they just add the questions I want? What's the holdup? Why is this hard? Well, I want to just go over a few of the obstacles we run into with this sort of data advocacy. First of all, almost all data collection has a timeline involved, meaning that there is a particular date by which they finalize the survey instrument. They finalize the local climate survey, they finalize the YRBS, and then they conduct it afterwards. Meaning, and that's to ensure best results. You can't change survey midstream, or else it will get mixed up results that won't mean anything. And so timeline can be a limitation, and it's important to understand the process by which you're putting together a survey or the cycle of a survey like the YRBS, so that you know when to ask and when to conduct your advocacy to make the most difference. The process varies for this sort of thing by entity, by school district, by organization. I mentioned every single YRBS site has their own individual process. So it's important to understand, like, what is the process locally. Sometimes there's political or process limitations. For example, a particular school board or superintendent might be afraid to ask questions about LGBTQ or gender expansive students. They think they might face community backlash. Same is true at the state level. Perhaps there are lawmakers in place that are not friendly to LGBTQ issues, and they might not be willing to add questions. So there can be limitations there. The lack of understanding why data is needed. I mentioned previously that there was a lack of understanding about, well, why do we need to ask about gender expression? And so being able to express why it's important and that it affects a lot of students is really critical. There is often a limited number of questions on a survey, particularly a survey like the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And so sometimes questions need to be removed from a survey in order to add the question that you want, which can be very, very difficult for the local entities. So you need to sometimes describe or advocate for removal of a different question to add this question. A lot of places, as I indicated before, don't understand why it's necessary to have both a gender expression question and a sexual orientation question. And the answer is because they look at different things and they're independent predictors of risk. They predict different outcomes. Gender expansive youth, the majority of them are heterosexual, and so they don't face the same risk profile as sexual minority youth. It's a different risk profile. And finally, there's often a lack of ability to analyze the question. And this is more so true before we published this new report that shows how to analyze the question. But even still, it can be challenging, and so there needs to be capacity to analyze the question. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the things to keep in mind when moving forward with advocacy. The majority of the time, people that could add questions to a survey, be they YRBS coordinators or local school climate coordinators or school district, for example, no one's ever asked them to add questions about LGBTQ young people or gender expansive young people. No one's ever asked them to ask about gender expression. It's just never come up. That's true in the vast majority of cases. So the first thing to keep in mind is to ask them. You can be the organization, the local advocate, to ask them to put on questions that are essential to understand the data for your population. So that sort of direct outreach to the individuals in charge of questions the survey is really critical. So ask them, and also work to develop a relationship with them. They might, for example, go to community groups when they're developing or formulating questions, or when they put together the full survey. You want you to be one of the community groups they go to, or one of the advocates they go to run questions by. So develop a relationship with them over time. Help to understand the process, and offer what support you can. Just be engaged with them. It's not a one-time advocacy thing. It's a continuing relationship. Below that, I wanted to note that it's important to engage in the formal process. Not every place will have a formal process around adding a question. However, often there will be. Like, for example, there might be a public hearing on questions that should be added. There might be a working group composed of external stakeholders or organizations that help decide what questions are used. Well, whatever there is, if there's a formal process, get involved with it. Just testify at the hearing, become one of the groups that's engaged in the stakeholder meeting, focus and become involved with the formal process. I mentioned earlier coalition support is really important, and it is. It's critical. If there are other youth education, health, parenting, or other groups that might have an interest in this question, reach out to them. Maybe you can create a sign-on letter that shows that they are all interested. Maybe they can conduct individual outreach on their own with the coordinator of the survey. It's important to note that often another group will be the best messenger. So if you're, for example, a group focusing on gender expansive and LGBTQ advocacy, maybe a group focusing on education or health might be the best messenger to reach out to the decision maker regarding the survey. So that's something to keep in mind. I mentioned previously developing tools, one-pagers, sign-on letters, maybe petitions, other sorts of methods that you can show that there is broad support for adding the question. And finally, support from authorities. And this can be an authority like a superintendent or a board member, a school board member. It can be a local representative at the state level. There can be all sorts of authorities, but showing that you have support for this from your other contacts can be really helpful. And so finally, Gender Spectrum asked me to talk a little bit about using data for advocacy. And so once you have all this data, how do you use it most effectively to support your advocacy? And I have a few general rules I wanted to go through. The first is that data should be used that's as local as possible. Oftentimes we just have federal data for things, and that's fine, but if you use federal data, you're going to hear all the time, well, how do things work here in Pierre or South Dakota? How do things work in our state, in our municipality? You know, we're really different from the federal government, so this data is irrelevant. You'll hear things like that. So it's important to get as local data as possible. If you can get state data, great. If you can get municipal data, great. If you can get a local school climate survey that shows results that support you, even better. So get as local as possible. Secondly, use data sparingly. No one likes to have a litany of facts, you know, cited at them. No one will retain it. It's not useful. Data instead should be used to provide context or supplement a focus on stories. So it's best to have people tell their stories, to have young people talk about why issues or why policy changes are necessary, and then supplement them with data, providing maybe just a few points to show that what happened to one person is just indicative of a broader issue. It's a broader issue for this population, for gender expansive students. Like, for example, if one gender expansive young person is able to testify about the bullying they face, well, maybe you can use data more broadly to show that this is widespread among gender expansive youth, and so we need an anti-bullying policy that specifically includes them. That's just an example, but use data to supplement and clarify existing stories. Use data with a clear relationship to advocacy goals. So it should relate as directly as possible to what you're trying to achieve, if that makes sense. And generally, population data is best if it's available. So there's sort of a hierarchy of data, and population data, as data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, for example, is considered the most accurate, the most non-biased, because we're looking at everyone and then pulling out things for specific populations. However, other sources of data can be used, but sometimes they're seen as not as helpful, or sometimes they're seen as biased. For example, if you're talking about organizational data, it can sometimes be seen as biased. And just to give you an example, the new gender expression data I talked about from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey can be really useful for advocates relating to things like disordered eating, bullying, and substance use among gender expansive young people. So those are just some examples of how the data might be used. I have a couple resources here about data advocacy. The Advocates for Youth YRBS resources includes things like sign-on letters and one-pagers, to give you an example. And also, GLSEN has a local school climate survey. So if you want to conduct your own local school climate survey at your school. And also, Gender Spectrum has identified several resources relating to legal and policy issues. I want to thank Gender Spectrum for allowing me to speak, and I am available for questions. My contact information. Thank you so much.
And I just want to thank Alison again for being part of this series and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us, and looking forward to continued partnerships. Thanks, Alison.
Are you there?